evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today to discuss the tense situation on campuses around the United States, and quite frankly, even beyond the United States at this point, resulting directly from the Israel-Hamas war, is Adela Cojab, who is a Jewish activist and law student with a great deal of experience with this campus politics and, quite frankly, anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic sentiments. She's been dealing with that even before her entry into law school, and now she is once again facing the battles we are seeing in the headlines every day. Adela, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today. So before we delve into the absolutely absurd theater of campus activity following the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, could you tell us a little bit about the background of your activism, how you ended up in this situation, what campuses you've been most familiar with, and what is the context for the events we're seeing today?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and for having this important conversation that I think too many people are glossing over. I'm originally Syrian Lebanese Jewish. My family moved to Mexico. I grew up there, and I went to NYU, New York University. It was my dream school. And when I showed up, honestly, NYU was a good place. It was a great place for Jewish students. I was involved in Jewish life, and I didn't have any issues really until 2018. There had always been a small, vocal anti-Israel group, but for the most part, they threw their events, we threw our events, and we really stayed separate. But in spring of 2018, everything changed, and the Jewish community at NYU faced consistent harassment. It started with typical boycotts, with typical pushes for BDS against Israel, with a boycott against our NYU Tel Aviv campus, 70 professors boycotting Tel Aviv academics, and then 53 clubs boycotting the pro-Israel clubs. Jewish students felt isolated. We felt like we were being hit in every direction. We felt that walking into a class knowing your own professor was boycotting Israel was a difficult environment to be in. But then things escalated. As we continued on campus, it got to the point that every Jewish event we hosted would be protested. They would post pictures of Jewish students online, calling us colonizers and fascists and Nazis. I was on student government. I was being constantly bullied. I actually had to leave my position because of it. I was studying in the Middle Eastern Studies department. No students would partner with me for final projects. And I actually had to take my final exams in a separate room from my classmates. My professor himself told me to stop coming to class because my existence in the class was a distraction for other students. And all of it culminated at a Yom HaAtzmaut celebration. Usually every year, Jewish students get together. We rent out Washington Square Park, which is the center of NYU's campus, and we bring a DJ, we give out flags, snacks. It's usually a beautiful celebration. And my mom, who's a Syrian Lebanese Jew who grew up in Mexico, she comes every year and she sees hundreds of students wrapped in Israeli flags, singing Hatikvah. And she looks at it and says, this is Judaism in the 21st century. It's a beautiful event. But that year I knew would be different. And I told the school I was worried for student safety. The school kept telling me I was overreacting. I'd been meeting with administrators for months at this point about the attacks against the Jewish community. And ultimately, at the Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, it kicked off with a student coming to the front of the protest with an Israeli flag, lighting it on fire, and letting it burn. Later, when we were singing Hatikvah, that beautiful moment, another student that I had a lot of classes with actually came to the center, grabbed the microphone from a Jewish girl, shoved her, and started yelling, "Free, free Palestine." And then later we looked up and we saw that they had taken our other Israeli flags, torn them to shreds, and hung them from the trees and from the lampposts. And this was happening in New York University, right? This is NYU, this is Manhattan. So you have what's usually a beautiful event, display of Jewish pride, and instead you have our flag burned, hanging from trees, and a Jewish girl assaulted and battered. And that's when I went back to the school. I said, something has to change. A line has been crossed. The school promised action and instead gave an award to the group that spent 2 years harassing the Jewish community. So after the award was given, I was about to graduate, and the administration refused to meet with me. Suddenly, they wouldn't answer my emails. They wouldn't answer my calls. So I got in touch with lawyers and I asked if I had a case against the school. And unfortunately, at the time, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act didn't include Judaism under its protections. So they told me outright, no, you don't have a case. But after sending them the footage, the screenshots, the emails, I sent them 70 pages worth of documents. They told me that this could be a foot in the door, at least for publicity reasons. So I sued NYU right before I graduated in 2019. I made publicity for my case, and my case made it to the ears of the White House. President Trump had heard about it, and he invited me to speak with him at a conference in December of 2019. I did, and 3 days later, he signed an executive order that would expand the definition of Title VI to include Jewish students. Shortly after that, NYU, now falling under Title VI and realizing my lawsuit actually had some teeth, quickly settled. And the only thing I asked for in my lawsuit was for them to include Judaism under their existing discrimination policy. Because all of these students, all these schools care about discrimination, but they didn't even have Judaism and anti-Semitism in their existing parameters. So since then, I worked with college campuses full-time for 2 years here in New York and around the country. When they had anti-Semitic situations, I would fly in and help them deal with it. I mainly dealt with campuses here in New York. I worked a lot with Columbia. I continue to work a lot with NYU. And now I'm in law school, hoping to specialize in bringing these kinds of lawsuits to make sure Jewish students are protected.
That's quite a story, and all aspects of it are really amazing. But I want to break it down issue by issue before we get to where we are today to understand really some of the things you're telling me. One is obviously the non-responsiveness, the lack of inclusion of Judaism and Jewish students in the overall policy of DEI, and I've heard complaints about it from various campuses, but I'll get to that momentarily. First, I want to address something you said at the very beginning, which is up until 2018, there weren't any serious issues. There wasn't this concerted attack. And all of a sudden in 2018, from zero, from nothing, NYU went to this really massive action with very, very organized number of organizations and so forth involved in that. That speaks to me about a preparation process by somebody and some sort of a concerted activity that brought all of these people, organizations, activists together. Is there any insight that you've gained into who that might have been and how that came to pass?
Yes, 100%. So I've actually done a lot of work and a lot of studying on this. Students for Justice in Palestine is an organization that has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I've actually read their manual multiple times, and I've read their materials, and I've really studied the way that they organize and mobilize. So let me explain how Students for Justice in Palestine works. Usually they divide their year into 2 semesters. They have a dormant semester and they have an active semester. In that first fall semester, let's say they have an executive board of 10 people. It's only a small group, 10 people. The only job of those 10 people for that whole semester is to join another club and to become friends with 2 of their leaders. That's their only task. And the events that they're hosting aren't teach-ins, they're not protests, they're not speakers. The only events that they host are social. That way, you have a good relationship with 10 different clubs, usually the more powerful clubs on campus, like the Black Student Union, the Latino Student Union, the LGBTQ associations. They befriend 2 of their leaders and they invite them in to have a social event. They have multiple social events during the fall semester, and they really form friendships. Over winter break, SJP National sends already drafted BDS resolutions to each campus. They already have a list of speakers that they want each campus to bring, and they already have a date chosen to launch everything and to have a rally. So by the time the spring semester starts and Jewish students come on campus, the wheel was already turning. And suddenly all of these people are activated. Suddenly you have 53 groups signing a boycott against Israel in the 3rd week of the semester. How did they organize it so fast? Well, the answer is they weren't organizing at the beginning of the spring semester. They had been organizing from the semester before. And that's how you have the resolution hitting student government. Then the next week, the professors signed their resolution. And the week after, 53 groups signed the resolution. All of that was in play before. They already had their teach-ins planned, and they already had their speakers planned. They already had their boycotts planned, and Jewish students are ambushed because we're not planning that far in advance. And again, it's been well documented that SJP does have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as other organizations that are funded by extremist Islamic groups. And it's something that's very concerning, because as a Jewish student on campus, you just want to have a fun 4 years. You're not showing up thinking that you're looking for a battle. No one shows up to campus saying, I'm ready to fight. But SJP finds students and they tell them, you're looking for a battle and you have to get ready to fight. And that's why Jewish students are always caught off guard.
It sounds like SGP is actually more manifestation of more serious networks behind it than simply, however well-trained students. Because without this level of weight behind them, I don't know whether anyone would even listen to them. Why would they? They're students, just like any other group on campus. So let's talk a little bit in more depth about this network behind SGP. You mentioned Muslim Brotherhood and other extremist groups. Who exactly funds them and through what channels?
So usually they set up other nonprofits here in the US, and those nonprofits are the ones that end up funding SJP. Actually, right now, the US Congress this past week signed a bill that's going to be going into the Senate soon to be voted on. It's been in the House since January. This is it since October 6th, that actually looks to identify terror networks. And it'll start naming both organizations and individuals who are associated with terror networks. That way they could actually start tracing the money. There's a lot of different studies that have been done to be able to find where SJP gets their funding, but nothing has been definitive except for the ties they have to the Muslim Brotherhood. And like you were saying before, again, it's not just students. These are professionals who are guiding students through this process. If you read the BDS resolutions, those were not crafted by students. Those were not written by a 20-year-old. Those are resolutions that are professionally crafted. And it's something that we should really be wary of. It's something we should be very afraid of. Again, the SJP manuals are long. They're hundreds of pages. And actually for October 7th, all of this was also planned in advance, because as soon as October 7th started, even I, who am outside of the SJP circle, got a mobilization guide with messaging. It already had graphics. It already had chosen that day, the Wednesday after October 7th. It already had that day chosen as a day of protest. It already had Friday as a day of rage. It already had graphics for these, informationals for students to be posting to their Instagram. And that's how you realize all of this is connected in a broader network, because October 7th also wasn't a sudden act of resistance. October 7th was an ambush that had been planned for years by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Resistance. This is how it always has been. They had been planning this attack for years. They planned an ambush for years. They already had everything in the network for years. And their students already had materials for the week after. They already had messaging and talking points to talk about how this happened because of 75 years of oppression. This happened because of Israeli occupation. They already had everything ready. And that's how you see everything was connected. And part of me makes me wish I was involved in SJP more, because maybe I would have been tipped off. Obviously, no one could have expected October 7th. Israeli intelligence was ambushed by October 7th. No one expected it. But students on campus were already preparing. And when you start seeing it that way, it all just comes together.
So what you're saying right now suggests something very sinister, which is that not only is JP's connected to Muslim Brotherhood, which for those who still think it's some sort of a democratic grassroots movement, is actually a tribal, hierarchical, and completely anti-democratic structure that emerged in Egypt and has always followed this familial network with ties to extremism that has for generations pushed for a sort of war between political Islam and everybody else, including other Muslims, by the way. Muslim Brotherhood is not designated as a terrorist organization in the United States, though it is in some other countries. But Hamas is, and what this is telling me is that SJP does not only have ties to this wider network, but it has direct ties to Hamas, and that Muslim Brotherhood continues supporting Hamas abroad in more than just broad ideological sense. They're facilitators and active facilitators of terrorist plans. This defense of a terrorist attack that took place, it seems to me, was highly coordinated with these students. To some degree, they're ideological facilitators of the propaganda and information warfare aspect of this attack. So the question is, clearly Hamas has a much greater presence in the United States than simply, a few symbolic gestures here and there. Clearly, we have a situation where the United States has designated Hamas as an international terrorist organization, and yet you have a significant number of people openly supporting it and providing it ideological comfort to an organization that is terrorist. How did this come to pass that we have students on campus who are not merely pro-Palestinian, who are not merely pushing for a two-state solution or are not happy with some of Israel's actions, but outright support terrorism?
So the answer comes down to the professors. If you look at it, countries like Qatar have donated billions of dollars to US universities. They've created fellowships for professors to be the Edward Said professor, the postmodernist professor, the decolonization professor, and this idea of postmodernist decolonization, uncolonizing your mind, decolonizing countries, the global north and the global south, the globally dominant and the globally oppressed, creates a false dichotomy. So when you sit in your own classes and you listen to your professors, people who you look up to, of course these students are going to be radicalized. I want to tell you a story of what happened at NYU when I was there. I was taking a Middle Eastern Studies class. It was going to be 12 weeks. The last week was going to be about Israel, Palestine. I knew that's where I was probably going to have a lot of issues. But my issue actually started before, because around week 4 or 5, we did a unit about 9/11. And I got the reading. And as I'm doing the reading, it was talking about how Osama bin Laden wasn't a religious extremist. He was actually a computer engineer that used the language of religion to mobilize the social classes in order to fight for freedom. And as I was reading it, I said, but he was a terrorist, right? So I assumed we're going to get to class and talk about how people will use religion to mobilize people in order to cause them to do terrorism, how you mobilize masses, how you take a disenfranchised group and how you activate them for terror, and how that is so scary and something we should be looking out for. And he was only he was only an engineer. He was a computer engineer, but he was able to mobilize people using religion, like co-opting religion as his cause, right? So that's what I thought the class was going to be about. But I show up and no, he's just basically reiterating the readings. My professor is sitting there saying how Osama bin Laden was just a computer engineer and he had a secular education and he was fighting for freedom. And I raised my hand in class and I had to say, but he was a terrorist, right? And the rest of the class rolled their eyes on me. And the professor said, yeah, I'm sure here they would call him that. And I just looked around saying, how are we at New York University, 30 blocks from the World Trade Center? And we're talking about how Osama bin Laden was a chemical engineer and some would call him a terrorist. And I started feeling crazy. And this is only in one class, and this is not even about Israel and Palestine. So again, when your own professors are telling you that the world is about the oppressing class and the oppressed class, and we must overthrow the oppressors, and even America is painted in this light within America, that's how you know we're the country of the free and there's no censorship, because I've never met someone that hates America more than American professors. And that's how this has come to be, because this is being entirely normalized. And when your entire 4 years on campus are hearing this narrative over and over and over again, when they present Hamas in this dichotomy, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and then they put Hamas as the elected leadership of the Palestinians, then of course you're going to look at this dichotomy as Israel's the oppressor and Hamas is the oppressed. Not Palestinians the oppressed, but Hamas is the oppressed. And it's something that should really be on our forefront. And again, I was in the Middle Eastern Studies department. I had to leave the Middle Eastern Studies department because it got to the point that saying things like he was a terrorist, right, was distracting to my classmates.
This is quite shocking to me, precisely for the reason that universities make such a big deal out of academic freedom and that professors can teach whatever they want in whatever way they feel fit. And yet people feel are literally pushed out for having alternative points of view. So how is that academic freedom if alternative views are not welcome and quite frankly professors literally ban students from classes? That's a broader question for I guess as a legal perspective, but to me that's a very strange definition of academic freedom, wouldn't you say?
think it's definitely a strange definition of academic freedom. And sometimes you'll find that the people who talk most about inclusion are the ones who most exclude others, right? And that's something that you'll see on college campuses on every single level. You'll see it socially, and you'll see it like again, it's one of those things. Also, one of the reasons people ask me, they're like, well, all these professors that signed a boycott, right? 70 professors boycotting Israeli academics, and this was at NYU. People said, well, did you ever talk to the Jewish professors and the Israeli professors? Maybe they could do a counter boycott, a letter.
Mm-hmm.
So I did. I went to the Israeli professors. NYU has a Center for Jewish Studies and a Center for Israel Studies. And when I approached the heads of the departments, the professors all told me the same thing. They said, well, we're here to teach. We don't get involved in campus affairs. So we support you, but no, we're not really going to get involved in this. And it's because the Jewish professors see their job as a job, and their job is to teach. If they're a professor of economics, a professor of mathematics, even a professor of Judaic studies and Israel studies, their duty is to teach their class and to have a syllabus. But the duty of the other professors is to get involved in student life. That same professor, the one that was talking about Osama bin Laden, he was one of the advisors to Students for Justice in Palestine. So Students for Justice in Palestine has faculty advisors across the Middle Eastern Studies department, and they're being advised, they're being supported by them. The professors are coming out with statements in support of them, and Jewish students are sitting there feeling alone because their professors are here to do a job. And it's because we understand what America is. We understand America is freedom, and we haven't gotten involved in shutting other people's freedom of speech down. We've never stooped to that level, but SJP and the professors who support them have been playing on that level for years. And that's why they play dirty. And we are still afraid to get our hands dirty with that.
You touched on something that may be a little bit controversial, and I'd like to push back on a little. You mentioned that Jewish students are feeling alone and isolated, but to me, it sounds like what you're talking about is a much bigger problem than Jewish students in a specific issue concerning Israel, because when you're talking about defending people like Osama bin Laden, that's an American issue. It's an international issue, because Osama bin Laden was an internationally recognized terrorist, and he attacked the United States, not Israel. So the question is, where are the other students who are not Jewish, who may not be even interested in Israel-Palestinian conflict, but who nevertheless might be resentful of people like Osama bin Laden being normalized and legitimized on campus? It sounds to me it's not just the issue of pro-Arab, and the leftist activists and revolutionaries and all sorts of subversives versus the Jewish students, but people who are against terrorism versus people who are for terrorism. So where are the non-Jewish students who would be concerned about such things? Are there any? And also non-Jewish professors who are, not necessarily focused on Israel or anything like that, but who are likewise opposed to that. Do they take the same position?
So I'll tell you where they are. They're just not in those classes, right? They're studying pre-med, chemistry, biology, economics, finance. They're studying closer to vocational real professions. I decided to be a Middle Eastern studies major. I decided to get involved in the humanities and the social sciences. I took sociology. I took all of these classes that I was interested in. And the people who are taking those classes too usually don't have the same mindset as me. And especially, for example, like people who are veterans, right? Who come back to colleges. There's a lot of veterans at NYU, but they're older than we are, right? They're not coming into college as a 18-year-old kid straight out of high school. They're coming to college as someone who's 22, 23, 24, who saw military service and is now coming to build a life. And they see college for what it should be, which is to prepare you to get a job, to have a higher salary, to be able to support your family. A lot of these people that are in the departments I was in go into academia. And it becomes a self-feeding cycle, because the same people who are in that class, when I raised my hand and said, but he was a terrorist, right? Those are people who chose to be in that class. And those are people who, guess what, probably right now are working for a lot of nonprofits that are continuing to help either the Palestinian cause or to decolonize this place or to end this, end that. And it's one of those things that they all become career activists. Look at me. I ended up becoming a career legal activist, but I took a different route because of what I was seeing and because of the way that my community was targeted. I came in with strong values because of who I am. but people who were like me aren't taking those classes, right? So it's something that should be very scary. And the way I see it is that there's hardliners and then there's human rights types, right? The hardliners, those are people you will never change. Those are people who usually have a personal tie to the conflict, or people who are so disenfranchised from their home community, usually members of the LGBTQ community, people who have felt ostracized, that have a lot of anger and channel it towards something. You will never change their minds. Those are the people who truly believe from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Those are people who truly believe they want to globalize the intifada. But then you have the 60, 70, 80% of people who really just think they're doing the right thing. That's the girl, for example, who took a dance class and they did the Palestinian dance of resistance. That's the kid that took a film class and they showed a film about Palestinian refugees and about how horrible the conditions are in Gaza and the West Bank and the refugee camps that they have throughout the Middle East. Those are kids who were going about their life, making their careers, but then something was introduced, right? You're taking a class on documentary making and then something was introduced. And that's your only tie. And the way I like to explain it to people who, because again, we're close to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and we've been talking about this for years. But let's say you're a student on a college campus and someone comes up to you with a clipboard and says, are you willing to condemn the Armenian genocide? And you say, oh, I don't really know. They're like, well, let me tell you about it. And they start talking about the Armenian genocide of Turkey against the Armenians. And they're telling you all of these things, and you've never really heard about this. You know where Turkey is, kind of. You know that Armenians are a people, kind of, but you don't really know much. And then they ask you to sign a petition. Of course you sign a petition. And now you're going to forget about this entirely. But then you show up to your film class 2 years later, and they're showing you a documentary about the Armenian genocide. So that's your second contact. And then when you're walking on campus and you see a group of students protesting against the Armenian genocide, you're also like, oh yeah, what Turkey's doing is horrible. I saw a documentary once, I even signed a petition. And that's how a human rights type is mobilized. And this has been happening on college campuses against Israel for years and years and years, 25 years upwards, where again, the leaders of this kind of thought were on college campuses themselves, and then they came back as professors like Edward Said.
So it seems to me that there's a culture of a mobilization that is not being actively counteracted simply because people are not in that mindset, they're not prepared. And frankly, how pro-Jewish, pro-Israel students and faculty have been looking at presenting the side of the story has been completely not in line with the techniques of these people. We're talking about Hasbara, Israeli Hasbara. It's basically a PR outreach about cherry tomatoes and Startup Nation and things that have nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with revolutionary activism that, quite frankly, follows the model that we are seeing around the world on completely unrelated issues, but very much along the same lines. So we are looking at basically information warfare versus PR, and the two do not align at all and require completely different skill sets, completely different mindset, approach. And so far, we, despite these things, anyone who's trying to counteract is talking past each other, because you cannot go with a corporate set of skills trying to sell, a tour to, or business investment into Israel to a campus where there's this level of indoctrination with a very politicized mindset. It's quite obvious that a clash is inevitable. So that brings me to the other point before we get into this current events, which is what you mentioned earlier, DEI and the non-inclusion of Judaism and this sort of weird perceptions of Jews not being worthy of or fitting into categories that are a protected class under previous, previous legal frameworks. And there's been a lot going on where the Jews are white, where the Jews are not white, whether they are minority or not minority. And of course, from a religious perspective, it's a religion, but then, somehow it's considered, not something that is needed to be protected in the United States. What is the situation like right now? I'm hearing all sorts of reports from people basically saying that Jewish students, even when Judaism is actively included, it's not being enforced. So even if you make complaints on campus, nobody will necessarily respond to you. How has this aspect of the situation come to pass that Jews under DEI are considered to be an oppressor or at least an unprotected class?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So actually the way I want to answer this is because of a Jewish mindset that we have. The Jewish people have a mindset of rebuilding. We've always had a mindset of rebuilding, right? But I once spoke to a rabbi and he was telling me, why do we have Rosh Hashanah, the new year, before Yom Kippur, right? Why do we start a new year and then we ask for forgiveness, right? Then we start looking at our year in review and then we get sad. Why don't we do that first and then we start the new year fresh? And he said, because as the Jewish people, we understand that when you have tragedy or when you have a bad situation, the first thing you have to do is start fresh and move forward. And once you've started moving forward, then you can look back. It was the same thing with the building of the state of Israel. We had just come off of a horrible tragedy. We had just come out of a genocide where 1/3 of the world's global Jewish population was exterminated in one fell swoop. And the people who arrived in Israel started building it immediately. And only afterwards did they look back, right? And it's one of those things that we get up and we start doing. So when the Jewish people came to the United States, be it leaving Russia, leaving the Holocaust, or leaving the Middle East because of oppression, we got to our host countries and we started rebuilding. We threw ourselves into our work and we started rebuilding. That's why Jewish professors don't get involved in campus work, because they are rebuilding. They're doing their profession. We have a very rebuild mentality. And because of that, we were able to, as a community, become relatively successful. Again, Jews are not a monolith. There are Jews living below the poverty line, and people always refuse to look at that. But one of the issues is that a lot of DEI is based on colorism, and they don't realize that Jewish people can be many different colors, right? We're never going to be seen as a minority. We never will, because number one, we became successful as a global community. Even again, that's not even wholly true, because there's a lot of Jewish people, especially Holocaust survivors, are living under the poverty line. And because they see us as white, even though, again, that's not true. Most of my friends are Persian and Syrian. I'm Syrian Lebanese. I don't know why I look the way I do, but I could tell you my grandmother doesn't look like me. She's maybe 3, 4, 5 shades darker than I am. She looks entirely Lebanese. You saw her on the street, you'd say, oh, that's Selma Hayek's cousin.
But
Why?
let's
Because my grandmother is Lebanese.
but
And it's something crazy.
if we even take these racial, politics, which are, to be honest, a little bit scary in the 21st century, given the history of eugenics and colorism and all of that, quite frankly, there are Palestinians who look, kind of like
Much lighter than me.
Yeah, that's so. How does anyone really tell unless they know?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things. At NYU, I was part of the Latino Student Union. And when they were voting for BDS and I started trying to be vocal, saying, look, like, I don't think that we should be voting for this or whatever. And I had just gotten involved and they're like, Adela, really? You are in the Latina Student Union? I'm like, I'm not a US citizen. I was born in Mexico. You're a US citizen. You come in through the US citizen line. You're a first generation American. And we got into this big discussion, and want to know how it ended? They created a group called the Black and Brown Coalition, which, even though I'm a Mexican national and I'm not a US citizen and I speak Spanish at home and my dad lives in Mexico, my grandparents live in Mexico, and my cousins live in Mexico, I can't join because I'm not Black or brown. And people have really dumbed it down and turned it into colorist. They've
But
turned it
just
into
how brown
colorist.
do you have to be to join these things? Do they?
That's a crazy question to ask, but
this
that's
and
what they're asking. Exactly. No, it's really something that's scary, and it dumbs it down for everyone. And again, I think like they use Jewish success against us. Instead of saying, look at the Jewish people who came from the ashes of genocide, pogroms, and oppression and built themselves up in this country. Instead of looking at it that way, they see it as, oh, the Jewish people are oppressed, or the Holocaust didn't actually happen, or it wasn't even that bad. That's where people go. That's where their minds go. And it's one of those things that, what, as Jewish people, should we wish we weren't hard workers? Should we wish that our family came here and just sat depressed and did nothing? No, I'm very proud of the way our ancestors got back up. I'm very proud of the way that my ancestors, my grandparents, my great grandparents left Syria and Lebanon, got to Mexico, and immediately started selling whatever they could to make some money to buy fabric, to sell that door to door. I'm proud of their story. I retell their story because I am a product of that story. And now I live in New York and go to top universities, and I have the education I have after my grandpa didn't even finish primary school, right? It's one of those things that I really think is about resilience, and they're using resilience against us because we refused to be victims. Yes, they say that Jewish people have a victimhood complex. We don't. We acknowledge our victimhood to show people how impressive and absurd it is that we made it to where we are. That's why we talk about the Holocaust, to say, and from the ashes we rose. We don't talk about the Holocaust to say, oh, we were victims. No, no, no. We talk about it to say, and look how far we've come. And it's something that should be inspiring. And instead, the rest of the world uses it against us. What would they have preferred?
Interestingly enough, what you're saying suggests that the DEI structure, the way it currently is on college campuses, at least, I can't speak for everybody everywhere, but what you're describing is that it's based on grievance culture and, victimhood, hierarchy that seems to be deliberately selective of the kind of
Yes.
victims they want to include and what sort of a attitude they want to project, which is not about rebuilding from whatever bad experience you have, but simply essentially comparing who's had it worse and just fighting oppressors. So this is just another continuation of this revolutionary politics that is highly divisive and not really helpful to the students themselves. It doesn't give them any skills, it doesn't give them any way to move forward, and certainly it doesn't provide them with anything useful. It's kind of reminds me after the Supreme Court essentially banned affirmative action use in academic selections. The new culture that emerged is grievance-oriented hardship essays about who's had it, about basically lifetime experiences that were bad, and that's become a trend in college application essays, and to the point that some people are literally fabricating bad things that happened to them in order to appear to have this sort of hardship that would get them in on campus.
Into a college, yeah. And again, what's happening with the Jewish community of not being counted as a minority worth minority status happens to a lot of Asian communities as well, right? We know that this is, and why? Because they have a similar mentality, because they themselves also have put themselves into their work. A lot of my friends that are first generation college students who are Asian, their parents grew up with nothing and they did everything they could to put their children ahead, right? So it's one of those things that success and decisions and sacrifice is being used against communities. And for some reason, we haven't been able to form an alliance, or we haven't been able to maybe it's a communication issue. Something got lost in communication, but because of that, the Jewish people are now being branded as something that we're not, which is oppressors. You think that there's a lot more Jews in the world. When I tell people that we're only 16 million, which is not even 10% of the followings of a single Kardashian or Jenner influencer, that's crazy, right? If we all followed one Instagram account, we wouldn't even have 10% of the following of a celebrity. That's how few Jews there are in the world. People don't understand that. That people just don't, they can't fathom how few there are of us because of how much they hear about us.
And that brings me to this unfortunate topic of post-October 7th wave of hatred that has engulfed college campuses and the university response to these horrific developments. And first of all, I want to hear a little bit more depth about how it went along at NYU specifically, since you have the closest ties to that particular campus and in general. And second, I want to see after, what was the university response, and why do universities feel that they can respond the way they do?
Yeah. So I don't believe that administrators are anti-Semitic. I really don't. I think that they're scared. I think they're a little bit lazy and don't like to work hard. And I think that they like to follow protocols and they're a little bit spineless because they don't want to lose their jobs. So what happened at NYU, I don't think that the administration failed to act because they were anti-Semitic. I think the administration failed to act because they didn't have the protocols in place to deal with it. Number one, they didn't have a definition of anti-Semitism. So if something happened on campus, they weren't able to say, oh, that's anti-Semitism. And then they didn't have a protocol in place on how to deal with anti-Semitism when it occurs. And that's why in my lawsuit, the only thing I asked for was define anti-Semitism and put a protocol in place to deal with it when you're faced with it. And that protocol should be the same as the existing discrimination policy for every other student, because that's just how it should be. Jewish people are a minority, define our minority status, which of course includes anti-Zionism, and then put protocols in place as to how to deal with it when you're faced with it. Because let's look at the flag burning, for example, right? Let's look at the flag burning. If I would have burned a flag at NYU and said, I hate immigrants, it's a political position, I have nothing against Mexico, but I'm going to burn a Mexican flag because of my politics, right? I have nothing against Jews. I'm going to burn an Israeli flag because I'm an anti-Zionist. It's about my Zionism, right? It's a politics statement. Are you telling me that if a group burned a Mexican flag at NYU, Mexican students wouldn't feel afraid? Are you telling me the school wouldn't do anything about it? Are you telling me the school would give them an award for it? If you want to say it's identity, let's say it was an LGBTQ flag. If an LGBTQ flag was burned at NYU, right? Because I identify as a Zionist, it's an identity that I'm choosing, right? Because my Judaism is separate from that, let's say. Someone identifies as LGBTQ. If you burned an LGBTQ flag at NYU, do you think the school would be giving an award to the group that burned it? Of course not. And if we want to take all politics, all identity, all nationality out of it, let's say that a fraternity burned the flag of another fraternity. These are two social groups, non-political, nothing. Are you telling me the fraternity that burned the flag is allowed to continue to recruit and throw events? I know for a fact they would be suspended. I know this because I was in a sorority and I was in the Panhellenic Council and the Intergreek Council, and I know our protocols for conduct issues. So why is it that the only flag that can be burned on campus is mine? And not only is it not alarming, it's being celebrated, because I know had it been any other flag, the school would have taken action. And that's why I filed my lawsuit, right? So let's talk about where we are now. What ended up happening? I did file my lawsuit. The law did change. Jewish students are now protected. Why? Because the law didn't change. The definition of Judaism changed, rightfully so, because Judaism is not a faith-based religion. You don't just wake up and say, I believe in the one Hashem, I believe in the Torah, I'm a Jew now, the way that most religions work. No, we have a very formal conversion process, and Jewish people is a peoplehood. So they expanded the definition of Judaism from a faith-based religion to an ethno-religion, because we're all part of a peoplehood. And by making us an ethno-religion, we would fall under the definition of Title VI, which protects against discrimination for nationality, ethnicity, and race. So let's look at where things are now. Where things are now is that Jewish students do have a claim under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, but the school is going to continue to be petrified to take action because they don't have the protocols in place. So we have to tell them what the protocols are, which is to use their discrimination policy that they have for any other minority group, and to pose the hypothetical. If I burned a French flag at NYU and said that French students don't deserve to be here, how would you react? And what would you do to assure the French community that they do belong in this school? First off, you would kick off any student that was burning the flag. Any student that took a physical action, immediately they would be suspended or expelled. Second, you would revoke the charter of the group that was hosting this event, promoting this kind of violence and this kind of rhetoric. SJP is still an instilled group in every single university. Very few universities have kicked SJP off. Even at NYU, after they burned the Israeli flag, SJP's charter wasn't revoked as a club on campus. It wasn't revoked. Why? Because the school is spineless. Administrators are afraid to take these actions because at the end of the day, they don't want to get canceled. It's the same thing as a student government kid that's voting in favor of BDS, not because they believe in BDS, but because they know that if they don't vote in favor of BDS, they're going to walk out and a bunch of students are going to surround them. Take this example, for example. We always say your silence is deafening, your silence is deafening, your silence is deafening, right? We force people to take stances on things, not us, but the world. As soon as something happens, why didn't your business put out a statement about Black Lives Matter, right? Mm-hmm. But with everything happening now on October 7th, I've had good friends message me saying, hey, I know I'm not Jewish and I see what's happening. And I want you to know I support you, but I'm not going to be posting about this publicly because I don't really know much about the situation. And I say, you know what? I understand. Thank you for reaching out and supporting me. But had it been the other way around, had I been a student personally affected the way I am, but I was from the other side, I would have said, no, your silence is deafening. You have to take a stand because your silence is being complicit. Why won't you take a stand against genocide? And I would push them to make that statement. So of course these students are scared. Why? Because we play on different playing fields. Like I said, their professors get involved, our professors don't get involved. My friends say, hey, I don't know if I can publicly take a stance, but I want you to know I support you. And I say, you know what? I appreciate your friendship. Thank you. Instead of putting my foot down and saying, no, your silence is deafening. Because I don't force people to take stances. And the Jewish people like that too. We've been dormant. We've been sleeping at the wheel. We haven't been pushing for SJV to be kicked off of campus, but they've pushed for Jewish students to be kicked off of campus too. They said that Zionist events are hindering their existence. right? Do you know how many times I hosted an event at NYU and it was protested by SJP? Almost every event I hosted in 2018 had a protest. We've never protested an SJP event. We would give out flyers. We would try to talk to the school and see if they could get it canceled. The school never would. It's one of those things that we've just never stooped to their level. And I'm having this rude awakening because I've been playing nice, noticing that people around me haven't. Does that make any sense?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure that there is a right answer. Is it, a good thing to try to push people who are uncomfortable with taking some political position to do that? And where do you draw the line where silence is complicity versus a political position?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, yes, when it gets to the point of October 7th, definitely, when people remain silent, they are kind of feeding to the other side. But on the other hand, if you start forcing people to protest every political student action, who is really going to stand with you? I mean, people
I agree.
have time to get involved in everything that happens, to research everything that happens, and sometimes it's just not. It's not cool. You can't force everyone to be an activist. That's just the
I
reality.
agree.
So how do you
But
get
then
more?
that's how I see it.
Mhm.
That's how I see it. But the other side doesn't see it that way. The other side is forcing people to be activists. So we're losing this battle. And again, I will never ask my friends to take a stand that they're not ready to take.
Mhm.
I will never do that because I understand what friendship is. I'd rather they text me individually and say, "Hi, I'm thinking of you. I'm thinking of your friends. I'm thinking of your family. How have you been?" I'd rather get that text than have them repost something. Would I want them to repost something? Of course. Am I going to force that on them? Never. Because again, I don't force people to take positions, but I'm realizing that it's just not the same on the other side. And I don't know the solution. I don't. I agree with you. I think that if we ask people to always post and always stand up and this, we're going to lose them, but we're losing them anyway. So
But
again, I don't know.
but that brings me to a more, to a very clear issue, which is regardless what other people do or don't do, Jewish students and pro-Israel students are not prepared. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
just talking in terms of organizing events, 6 months in advance and having links to some sort of intelligence about something that's going to happen. I'm not talking about this sort of political, deep-rooted and conspiratorial preparation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about when there is a threat, they do not have the numbers of supporters to actively collectively respond to it, and individually they don't have the basics of self-defense
Yeah.
to respond to physical confrontation. So any physical confrontation leads to a very one-sided outcome, as we have seen on campuses around the country. People barricading in the bathrooms, libraries, dorm rooms, and being afraid to come out. So how do we fight this culture of fear, and how do we actually prepare individual students who are in the front lines from not having this mentality of, well, if only we hide, it will go away, or we don't have any other choice but to hide for our own safety, except then it just keeps getting worse.
I wish I had a solution. I mean, when I was on college campuses, we used to offer once a year a Krav Maga class, just once a year, which is nothing. But I think that now it's something that we've all seen. Most synagogues started instituting Krav Maga classes too. Why? Because Krav Maga also is it's not like an aggressive. It's mainly about dodging attacks. When I filed my lawsuit, I started getting a lot of threats. When I had my situation on campus, I didn't feel safe on campus on social media. I had to put everything private. People would message me, we know where you live. So my mom did tell me to start taking self-defense, and I did. And my teacher was very clear to me. He said, look, end of the day, you will never be able to have the upper hand on someone coming for you. Why? Because I am a 5'4" girl. I just physically will never be able to overpower them. So everything he taught me was about like disarm and distract. Like you disarm by you just do like one jab to the throat and then you run away, or you just do one kick to the shin and you run away. It was all about the one move and run. And I think it's one of those realities too, where Jewish students on campus are a very small percentage. And when they see a mob like that, it doesn't matter how prepared they are. They could be former IDF soldiers that had 2 years of formal combat training. They won't be able to deal with what's coming around them. They won't be able to. So unfortunately, my solution is people are still at least willing to concede that physical violence is bad, right? And I don't know if this is going to be true for the next couple of months, but at least for now, people believe physical violence is bad. So I think we should leverage that. by number one, when we do have incidents, we have to show the world about it. Like with what was happening at Harvard, where they surrounded a student and they wouldn't let him leave. That's something we have to be showing the world, because they will still think that that's bad. Number one. Number two, every campus has to be notified. Every single campus has to be notified, and they have to be securing their students. I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could say every single student should be learning not only self-defense, but offense. They should be able to find that library. They're being locked in. They should be able to walk out. That's just unfortunately not going to happen because of the numbers game. There's going to always be very few of us, always going to be a lot of them. If you can't distract, disarm, and run, then the school should be protecting you, because the school has the resources. I think I spoke to public safety maybe once every 2 weeks when I was at NYU. At one point, they even gave me an escort. So it's one of those things that the school does have the responsibility to protect you. Unfortunately, for people who go to schools in big cities like this, for people who aren't students and don't have, a big university security, public safety apparatus behind them, it's going to be scary. It's going to be scary. And it's a hard time. Every day I ask, should I be hiding in my Magen David? And I decided not to. I decided to wear mine out. But the only reason why I have that is because when all this started, I was in Dubai, and then right after that, I went to Turkey. And that's where I didn't feel safe, because I didn't know the country. I don't know the law. If I'm in Turkey and I'm walking with a Magen David, I don't know who that's going to trigger. And next thing you know, I could be beaten up on the ground. And this country doesn't love me. This law enforcement, I don't know them. I don't know their laws. I don't know their government, their consulate. I did not feel safe. And for the second time in my life, I took off my Magen David, because that was a country I just didn't feel safe in. Here in the US, I don't feel safe, but I know I'm protected. Meaning, if God forbid something happens, I do know the law enforcement system. I do know the laws. I do know the country. And I do know that at the very least, physical violence against Jews is still something that's considered outrageous. So I will wear my Magen David. But had I been here when all of this started, if I wasn't in Turkey, would I still be wearing my Magen David now? Because my level of fear would have been as high as it was, as opposed to where I was in Turkey, and my fear was much higher. So it's a good question I ask myself. I still wear my Magen David, but I wouldn't tell other students that they have to. There's a line between being prideful and being stupid.
And that leads me, by the way, to a slightly bigger question about academic and general response, which is, first of all, a lot of these universities are private institutions where students are paying tuition to attend.
Yeah.
So the fact that they're not being protected, that mobs are allowed to congregate regardless of definition of Judaism or anything else.
Yeah.
Their universities appear to be derelict in their duty to protect paying clients from violence. So when do you expect to see lawsuits coming? And the second related issue is that so far I've only heard of one student from Cornell being arrested and charged with taking part in mob violence, but there are obviously dozens, if not more, people who took part in harassment and intimidation tactics in Chile and physically assaulting people. So when do we see greater criminal law enforcement of obviously criminal behavior?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In terms of when do I see the lawsuits coming, those are private rights of action. Those are going to be on the civil side, and those are already starting. I've been in touch with students at Columbia. I've been in touch with students at NYU, and I've been in touch with students at Cooper Union, which is here in New York as well. And those are only the New York schools that I've spoken to. And all of those students are thinking about filing their cases too. I've been in touch with them. I actually have 2 calls later today with 2 other students who are thinking about suing their schools under Title VI. Those are private rights of action. Those are going to take years. Those filings will probably occur in the next 3 to 4 months. And then the cases will take about 2 years. That's about how long mine took. So those are already coming, right? Right now, it's almost like a file has been opened and every instance is just being added to that file. And once that file is big enough, it will be filed with the Office of Civil Rights, and we will start those discrimination claims. Now, separately, and very correctly, you asked about the criminal claims. So the Cornell student, he was only arrested because of threats online, and because he was talking about mass shootings, and he listed addresses. He said, I'm going to come to 104 West, which is the Cornell Jewish student building, right? So that's why he was arrested, because of credible threats. There have been other arrests, but they've been arrests at rallies for reckless endangerment. They have not been arrests for harassment, for discrimination, for hate crimes. They've only been strictly on the penal law when it comes to physical action or crossing the line between a peaceful and non-peaceful protest. But I think this is also something I'm not optimistic about almost at all, because we saw what happened on June 6th, if we go back to Black Lives Matter, we had protests that turned violent. They were burning cars. People were looting stores, breaking windows, harassing people walking on the street, surrounding cars, and very few arrests came of that. And that was utter chaos. And what we're seeing now is chaotic, but it's still a more controlled form of chaos from what was happening in the streets of New York about 2 years ago, right? So after seeing that, no, I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic at all. I don't think that criminal charges are going to come from most of these rallies to most of these students or non-students. I just don't see that happening. I think that the NYPD specifically has been very hands off. I think Florida has been really good about it. I think New York has been very bad about it. So because I don't see criminal charges coming, I think it's important that students start taking note. One of the reasons why my case was strong enough to get to where it did was because I took videos, pictures, I had a paper trail, I checked everything. And right now, they themselves are videoing themselves harassing Jewish students. So they're creating the paper trail for us. And these are all going to have to just go to a civil lawsuit.
So finally, I want to address one more thing that you mentioned earlier, which is the investigation into SJP and its terrorist ties. So let's say in the best case scenario, we figure out that SJP has been taking direction from Hamas and other designated terrorist organizations. The entire national chapter is dissolved by law, and you cannot legally participate in that organization. And some people are even maybe criminally charged on the basis of their terrorist ties and financing and so forth. Nevertheless, that does not answer the broader question. What happens to most of the others who are not charged? What happens to the academics who've been taking direction from these sort of groups for years and have entrenched themselves in these departments? And what happens to normal students who want to be equipped to understand the Middle East by studying the subject formally in the academia? Why are they not entitled to a safe learning environment where they can actually learn and not be indoctrinated or forced to be silent? Why are we giving up the entire humanities area to people who are already there? And does it not leave a less prepared society?
That's a great question. So first, let's go with step by step. So base case scenario, let's say SJP's ties to Hamas are solidified. Let's say it is disbanded as a national organization. What I see happening on campuses is that the campus chapters will rebrand, right? They'll just change the name. They'll still have the same amount of people. They'll still have the same kinds of events, but they'll call themselves the Freedom in the Middle East Movement. FMMM, that MEM, that actually sounds like a great name, Freedom in the Middle East Movement. And that's what they'll call it. And they'll be doing the same things. Odds are some of their numbers will go down a little bit. It's also possible they'll go up because people who originally wouldn't want to join Students for Justice in Palestine because maybe it's controversial, now they'll hear something like Freedom in the Middle East Movement, and they'll be like, oh, maybe that's a club I should join. I like freedom, and the Middle East is an important area, and it'll still be the same kind of propaganda. So unfortunately, on campuses itself, I wouldn't see that problem going away. In terms of the professors that have ties, some of them, like you said, some of them might be arrested. The other ones, I think they're just going to keep teaching the same things. And you're right, we really let it go. We've let the humanities go as a community. And the Jewish professors that do teach in the humanities are either too scared to teach something different, or they've fallen on the other end. Actually, 2 of the anti-Zionist classes I took at NYU were taught by Jewish professors. One of them was called Palestine and the History of Politics. It was taught by Zachary Lockman, famous anti-Zionist Jew. And it was one of the classes that hurt. It hurt every single time I sat there, it hurt. But the class that hurt me the most was with Ella Shohat. She is an Iraqi Jew who had to flee because after the state of Israel was created, Jews in Iraq weren't safe. But instead of blaming her Muslim neighbors that turned on her, she blames the state of Israel for existing. And every single day in that class, it hurt me. Both of these were graduate seminars. I was an undergraduate student. I had to petition my way into them. I had to convince the department to let me take them, my own advisor to let me take them. Then I had to email the professors to let me take them because everyone in those classes were PhD students. And I was coming in as a cute little sophomore that, loves Hasbara and is president of my Israel group. I definitely wasn't equipped for these classes, but those classes hurt. And I wish I could have had conversations with each of those professors one-on-one years before they got into academia, but I didn't. So right now academia is lost, but what I see happening is planning for the long run, the way that they have. It's time to have those conversations. If you have a friend that's Jewish and anti-Zionist, the worst thing for a Jew is an anti-Zionist Jew, a Jew that is afraid to be Jewish in their capacity and their full extent because they're caving to what they think academia wants of them. If we start positioning ourselves in places to be able to get those positions, then maybe we can start changing the tide 10, 15 years from now. But unfortunately, right now, I agree with you. I think it's lost. And I think it's on the universities and it's on us also to push the universities to have programs that even out the narrative, that balance it out. Not necessarily more towards Israel, but more towards the center. It's interesting. I have two Palestinian friends. Both of them are against the state of Israel. Both of them believe that the IDF is an occupying force. Both of them are against Hamas. One of them, on October 7th, he was the first person I spoke to, and he was crying, and he said, Hamas just sealed the fate for my family. I'm scared for them because I know that Israel will retaliate. And he cried because of Hamas. My two Palestinian friends that live in the US do not support Hamas, but some blue-haired white girl on a college campus in America does. And it's something that, again, we've lost academia. And maybe we should start elevating voices that, again, are not necessarily pro-Israel, but at least are anti-terror.
That certainly makes complete sense. I just think that if you have entire generations of potential future policymakers, academics, think tank activists, and other soft power institution, media people who are completely radicalized, this is not just an issue of someone having a career in finance versus, just writing papers. This is an issue of an entire generation of people influencing the direction of U.S. foreign policy and conflict and understanding and more broader general influence. So I think we can't just look at academia simply, oh, well, it's useless, people who go into it are theoreticians who have nothing to contribute. That's not how the other side looks at it.
Yeah.
They use it as a tool for influencing in a wide variety of areas, and that's what concerns me, that there is no alternative, that if you want to be a pro-Israel academic, think tank activist, you don't even have a place where you can get your education. You can't get a PhD, and without a PhD, you are not going to have a career in those areas, because that's how it is. For even if you're an independent student who've studied, who's read everything ever written about the conflict and traveled and whatever, people don't take you seriously unless you have a PhD. And this is a problem. This is a problem, a generational problem for the future. We're already seeing its impact now.
Yeah, and that's not even just true for Israel. It's true for conservative values. I think right now there is no college institution you can go to with conservative values. And I'll tell you, so I went to NYU. You heard about my experience there. So when I was applying to law schools, I decided to go to Cardozo, right? Yeshiva University. I thought that maybe that would be a place where I wouldn't have to face any sort of thing like this. And because Cardozo is a Jewish university, but the students there aren't Jewish, right? The students are maybe 30% Jewish, 40% Jewish, which is more than any other school, but 50, 60% of the students or more are not Jewish at all, right? So our student government isn't Jewish. When October 7th happened, it took them a full week. They refused to put out a statement. They had to hold a vote on whether or not they should put out a statement. And when they did, they had a vote on a statement. The statement didn't even say the word Israel in it. And I felt so disappointed because I said I came to this school specifically because I never wanted to wonder whether or not my peers supported me. I never wanted to have to say, I wonder if my peers support me. And now I'm in a Jewish institution and I'm still not sure if my peers support me. It's something that's very scary. Again, it's something that's very scary that I wish I had a solution to, unless we start making our own institutions and we only start and we stop believing in freedom of thought, which I don't think is the solution. I wish I could tell you. And like you said, to be taken seriously, you need a PhD, and you're not going to have any professor signing on to your PhD paper if you're not parroting the same talking points they want you to. In my Middle Eastern studies classes, want to know how I got around this? Instead of writing an essay I didn't believe in and just keeping my head down, writing the essay, getting an A and moving forward, I wrote my essays about, like, for example, one of them, I wrote it about like an interview with a Likudist. And all I had to do was write Likud, talking points, and I said, this is what a Likudist would believe and would answer to these other global situations. And that's how I got around it. Because I wasn't going to write an essay coming from another direction. So instead, I wrote it very neutrally about Likudism. And by the way, I'm not a Likudist. I'm a Yesh Atid. but it's one of those things that I felt I needed to write about Likud in a non-negative light because everything else in my class was just, it was just so skewed to the other direction, right? So it was one of those things that like there is no way around it. And Jewish students, like again, like we're talking about PhD now, imagine an 18-year-old. They're petrified of their professors. They're leaving their parents home to a school. They're going to write whatever their professor tells them to.
Well, definitely that's a problem. So just last closing question.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen a number of donors and board members of various institutions either withdraw donations or otherwise, take threatening action. In many Ivy League schools, that doesn't really have a major financial impact because they already have substantial money in the bank and they get funding from these foreign entities. And we don't know whether the government will ultimately look to ban those potential ties, but there are plenty of financial resources for these universities. To what extent is it possible to mobilize some sort of a external pressure on these institutions? If the boards and donors don't make a difference, what does? How can reputation of these institutions be affected sufficiently for them to start taking these issues into consideration?
So whenever we talk about the Jewish drain, right? Whenever we say Jewish students will go somewhere else and Jewish donors will go elsewhere, we have to realize again, that's so marginal, like you said, in those universities that it doesn't make a difference. So I actually think we should be taking the opposite approach. I actually think that we should choose a school, focus on it, and give an endowment, right? An endowment, let's say, again, all these fellowships for professors. How about you have the Golda Meir Professor of Jewish Feminist Studies or of feminist leadership, and the Golda Meir Professor will ultimately be sponsored to be someone who isn't averse to our cause, right? Maybe we should start putting in more money and specifically designating what that money should go for.
But how do we control what happens afterwards? How do
you put it in the terms of the endowment? So for example, when they wanted to boycott NYU's Tel Aviv campus, it doesn't matter whether or not NYU wants to boycott a campus. It's an endowment, and the endowment is for the Tel Aviv campus. The campus is already funded. There is no boycotting. You know what I mean? And that's how the NYU Tel Aviv campus was able to avoid being shut down or boycotted, because it doesn't matter. You cannot protest an endowment. So if I create the Adela Cojab Israel Studies Center of NYU, it's the Israel Studies Center. And I could put somehow in the terms that, I'm going to designate who will be in charge of hiring. And next thing you know, we have 5 professors teaching at the Israel Center. Again, this is very big picture, and these are amounts of money that I will never be able to see in my life. But other than that, I wish I could say that there's another form of external pressure, but unless we reach audiences like, for example, conservative Christians who also think universities are being lost, there's no way for us to do it. There's no way. Like, I think that the worst thing that we could do is leave spaces where we are already a minority, because then we're letting other people decide where a Jew can and cannot feel comfortable. If you think Columbia University is anti-Semitic, imagine what it would be like without those Jewish students that are standing up and without those professors. It would be entirely taken. I think it's important to have strongholds. I don't think anything is a lost cause. Actually, again, like, I chose to go to Yeshiva University because of what I went through at NYU, and I've been regretting it because I wish I was on a campus right now where I could be making the noise and standing up. Because I wish I could stand up and say, this is my university and I'm a student here and I deserve to be protected the same way every other student did, because that's what I did at NYU, and that was able to have some sort of an impact, right? But at the same time, if I was a mother, would I want my kids to go to that school? And that's what I grapple with, the grappling with between the safety and the principle of standing up. Again, I wish there was a way to use external pressure. The only way I see it is to use civil rights. Let's use the language of civil rights. Title VI does exist. Judaism is now protected under Title VI. Let's hold them accountable. The same way that universities that used to discriminate against people of color were held accountable 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it's the same time to use those same laws and say, maybe you should stick to your word. You believe in civil rights, we have to believe in civil rights for all. And that's the only way I see it working, because I just don't think that we're strong enough to do it by ourselves. I hate ending on this negative note, but again, there's only 16 million Jews. That's not even close to the amount of influence that we need to be able to put on these institutions. And it's a shame.
I think the bottom line is we seriously have to rethink our approach. I think just completely ignoring the situation is clearly not the answer. I think what you said has a lot of logic to it. I think And I really also think that pro-Hasbara people also reconsider the types of conversations they have with everyone in general, in and or outside of academia. I think that approach does not work. We need to figure out what does. And we don't need to be aligning with terrorist organizations for that to happen, but we can learn something from them. We can learn this sort of forward organized thinking that has traditionally worked for Jewish organizations. That's how Jews came to be a very organized and successful community in the United States. We can form early relationships with people on campus before they're overtaken by SGP, and we certainly can talk about Israel and its role in human rights and security in other spaces, and not just focus on issues that don't speak to students, to idealistic people who want to make a difference. I think these conversations can happen.
So I agree. And the last thing I'll say is sometimes I look back at Germany, right? Germany after World War II, Germany after the Holocaust, Germany, where a whole country who hated Jews and wanted to be Judean free had to open its eyes. And within a couple of years, the regular people had to start standing up and saying, our policies were wrong, right? You will never change those SS officers that served as commanders. You'll never be able to change them, just like we cannot change our professors. But you could change the next generation. What did Germany do? They started talking about Holocaust education in every single school. They started teaching their own history in the way that it should have been taught, which is atrocious. This was an atrocity that happened. And it took a whole generation in order for people to change. And right now, if you see, Germany is one of the few countries that's actually standing up for Jewish people right now. It's one of the very few countries that's put laws in place. It's actually, Germany is leading by example. Some of its people are still marching in protest in the same places where Jewish people were being chased out of their homes. And that's scary to see. But at the same time, we see that the tide has changed and Germany is standing up. And if a country like Germany can do that, then here we still have a chance. So how about we apply those methods, right? How about we go to the elementary schools, we go to the middle schools, we go to the high schools, we go to the people who have not been touched yet by postmodernist decolonization theory, and we start teaching about the Jewish plight. Because maybe that's the future. Maybe we have to accept we will not change these professors, but we could change the next wave of students. And maybe we can't change this current wave of students, but maybe we could change the next wave of professors. Maybe it's time we start putting endowments in schools for certain types of professors to teach certain types of classes. Maybe it's time we start lobbying the schools to teach a class about inclusion that actually includes Jews instead of whatever BS they've been teaching up until this point. So maybe it's time to only plan ahead, because right now there's two wars that are being fought. There's a war on the front lines, which Israel will inevitably win, and the war of public opinion, which I believe Israel will inevitably lose. But if Israel can only win one, I know which one I want them to win. And I know which one I'm on the front line of. We're on the war of the diaspora, which is about continuing to make sure our existence isn't jeopardized in the countries that we live in. And that can only change through education. So I think it's time to start thinking about the future. If they're focused on the present, how do they defeat this present war? We might not be able to defeat this present war of public opinion, but maybe we can start planning ahead for the future.
That is a great note to end on, and I'm glad we're ending here. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for giving your insight on a situation that may appear otherwise bleak, but mere reactionism is not something we can afford, and the Oive mentality belongs in the shtetl, not in the United States in the 21st century. Today we have the tools, we have examples, and we have the skills to be able to respond. We just need to figure out how and start planning and start working towards it. For those watching, this was the Washington Outside the Report, and we had Adela Cojab talking about the wave of insanity and very negative sort of activism that has overtaken U.S. campuses, particularly elite schools, in light of the Hamas attack on Israel and what we can do about it. Stay tuned for our next show, same time as always, Tuesdays at 9 p.m.